I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. Well, the Trump administration has now announced that they are considering suspending habeas corpus. Now we're starting to understand the idea behind this invasion nonsense that has been coming out of the administration ever since Trump resumed the presidency. This notion that the United States is under an invasion by illegal immigrants, either from Venezuela or a Venezuelan gang or illegal immigrants from Mexico or what have you. We've heard this nonsense for years, of course, that from the right wing, that America's under this invasion. And that was nonsensical enough, but now we're understanding that there was more to it than just this invasion nonsense. We see now that they're using this as a ruse to suspend habeas corpus. And that's what they're saying. They're saying under the Constitution, if we're at war, the president has the authority to suspend habeas corpus. Now, why is this so important? Well, because habeas corpus, as legal scholars have pointed out for centuries, is the key to a free society. Without habeas corpus, you don't have a free society. And habeas corpus dates back centuries in English jurisprudence. Arguably, it even goes back to Magna Carta in 1215. But over the years and over the centuries, in British resistance to the tyranny of their own government, to the tyranny of their king, habeas corpus evolved and developed to such a point that it was so important that our American ancestors deemed it necessary and advisable to insert it into the Constitution. Now, what is habeas corpus? Why is it so important? Well, let's assume that a society has a constitution that guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press. Okay, great. It's all there written that the Congress, the government, the president, whoever does not have the authority to jail people for example, criticizing the government, dissenting against its immigration policies or its tariff policies. Great. But then what happens when the government says, well, we don't want people criticizing these policies. It's a matter of national security. And so they just start jailing people. They start rounding people up. They use the military to start rounding people up and putting them in the jail and torturing them to find out information on who else is doing this in the neighborhood. Well, there's nothing anybody can do about it. I mean, you can say, but we have freedom of speech in this country. And the president says, yeah, so what? Anybody who criticizes the tariff policies or the immigration policies or any aspect of what the government's doing is sitting there in jail. So where does freedom of speech come in? Well, that's where habeas corpus enters the picture. That a person has the right under habeas corpus to have a lawyer go into a federal court, which is an independent branch of the federal government, and seek and file a petition for a writ of habeas corpus. The judge issues that writ, and he orders whoever is holding that person in whatever torture camp or prison camp or whatever, penitentiary, jail, to bring that person into that federal court and show cause as to why he is being held. If there's criminal charges being filed against him, so be it. Let's see the criminal charges. Let's see the indictment that's being alleged against him. But if all he's in there for is because he's criticized the tariff policy or their immigration policy, obviously they're not going to be able to show that any criminal charges are being brought because that's not a criminal offense. So the federals will be stymied. They won't be able to show any evidence to sustain their holding of this person. So the judge at that point orders that person be released. He grants the writ of habeas corpus. And the federal official must comply with that order. Now, of course, the question arises, what happens if the executive branch, the government officials refused to release that person after the judge issued that order. Well, then we've entered the land of dictatorship. I mean, if under our system of government, the judicial branch is the final arbiter of what is constitutional or what is not constitutional. That's our system. If somebody doesn't like it, they can go and seek a constitutional amendment to change it. But that's our system. So if we reach a point where a president says, well, I'm not going to comply with that. I don't believe in it. I'm not going to comply with it anymore. He obviously has the national security state behind him, national security establishment, the Pentagon, the military, the CIA, the NSA, powers of massive surveillance, torture, indefinite detention, rounding up people. Then we've just entered the land of dictatorship. And a good example of this phenomenon is Chile. In 1973, the CIA and the military were the driving force behind a coup there that ousted the democratically elected president of the country, a socialist, some people would even say communist, named Salvador Allende, who had legitimately won the election. They were the driving force to oust him from power and install a right-wing military dictator named General Augusto Pinochet. And they loved Pinochet. I mean, this guy was rounding people up immediately. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. Killing some of them because they were communists. They believed in communism, including 2 American citizens. And torturing them brutally, including the women. Horrific ways to torture people, as they showed. And then tortured most of the tens of thousands of people in order to get information on who else was involved with communism and socialism. But there was no writ of habeas corpus. I mean, all these people were innocent people. Well, they were innocent in the normal sense of the term. They were guilty in the eyes of Pinochet and the CIA and the military and many U.S. officials because they believed in communism. See, that was considered a grave offense, and so that they could do anything they wanted to as far as they were concerned because of the global war on communism. But under normal, ordinary usage of language, these people's only crime was believing in socialism, believing in communism, having supported the president in a legitimate election. They were rounding those people up and they were killing them for that. Well, in a judicial system where the judicial branch of the government is independent, they could have issued writs of habeas corpus, getting these people released. But the courts went silent as soon as Pinochet took over. The judges and the lawyers were as scared as everybody else was, and because he could round them up, and torture them, kill them too. So this is a linchpin of a free society versus a dictatorship. Now, we've heard this nonsense about an invasion for how many years now? I mean, many years. I've heard it, gosh, I don't know how long. That, this was long before Venezuela immigrants were coming to the United States. We've long heard that illegal immigrants coming in from Mexico were invading. They're invading. And in and of itself, even without the notion of suspending habeas corpus and using it as an excuse to suspend habeas corpus, it's just a ridiculous argument. In fact, it's always amused me how the promoters of this concept of the invasion go silent when you ask them about this guy in El Paso that went over to a Walmart there and shot up a bunch of people, killed them, because his mindset was the same as them, that we're under an invasion, so he was killing invaders. And so people say, God, the guy's crazy. The guy's loco, I mean, to be doing that. I think he ended up with a life sentence in the penitentiary. But you have to ask why. If we're really under an invasion, he's over there killing the invaders, the Mexican Americans that were there at this Walmart. Now, some of them were Mexican Americans. Some of them, I think, were Mexican immigrants that he couldn't distinguish. Collateral damage, you would say, that, okay, he was killing the invader and he happened to kill some Americans at the same time because he couldn't tell the difference between a Mexican American and a Mexican just by appearance sake, and he certainly wasn't going to say, can I see your papers? But what I've never been able to understand is why the people that say that this is an invasion don't defend this guy and stand up for him and call for his pardon, because he was protecting America against the invaders by killing invaders. I mean, look, if America really got invaded by a foreign country, whoever, China, North Korea, or whatever, Cuba, I don't think anybody'd have any problems with civilians killing these invading troops coming in. I can't imagine somebody's going to go to court and have them indicted for shooting real invaders. Well, then why'd they indict this guy if it really is an invasion? Well, because it really is an invasion. Everybody knows that. Deep down they know that. The Trumpsters know it. But they want to make it seem that it's okay the way we're treating people. That if they're an invader, boy, we don't need to give them due process. So you see, we're now talking about in this area of civil liberties, which is critically important. This is the thing about the right wing. Conservatives have always been horrible on civil liberties, just horrible. I mean, as far as they're concerned, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments to the Constitution and the habeas corpus provision in the Constitution itself, and other aspects of civil liberties, the presumption of innocence, should just be discarded. I mean, they hate those things, right to bail, right to counsel, trial by jury. They hate these things. I mean, this is why they supported, for example, trial by military tribunal in Guantanamo Bay, which is still there. I mean, that system there, that's one of the gifts we got from the 9/11 attacks, is that we got a dual judicial system, totally unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court's not going to declare anything the national security establishment does is unconstitutional. And so they just established their own judicial system there to try terrorism cases, because they understood that a war on terrorism, which replaced the war on communism, would give them justification to do whatever they wanted. And that people were so scared, Americans were so scared, the terrorists are coming, Jacob, the terrorists are coming. They're just like the communists. Remember the Cold War fear? The communists are coming, the communists are coming. And so they're willing to surrender their liberties, and they did. I mean, when the Pentagon and the CIA announced this torture center in Guantanamo, I mean, there were people cheering. And then when the Supreme Court assumed jurisdiction over that area, which they thought would never happen, they really wanted Guantanamo to be like in El Salvador, where they could run their penitentiary like President Bukele does there, the dictator in El Salvador. That's what they wanted for Guantanamo, but with the dictator being the Pentagon and the CIA. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to take jurisdiction over this. Not that it mattered a whole lot, because the Pentagon and the CIA got ultimate say. There's been people there for 20 years or so, 25 years, without a trial. I mean, the Bill of Rights is clear. People are entitled to a speedy trial. You can't hold somebody in jail forever saying, well, okay, we're going to have a trial for you one of these days. Oh, yeah, no, it's tomorrow. It's tomorrow. I mean, that's not what a speedy trial is. But they just ignore it. And the Supreme Court says, oh, okay, well, if they say that they're going to have a speedy trial, even though it's been 20 years that they've been saying that's okay, that's okay. But you see, the Supreme Court cannot exercise jurisdiction over El Salvador. It's an independent country, and so they have figured out a perfect way to deny people due process of law. And so you've got situations where federal judges are issuing orders saying stop this, and they've stopped it, to at least as of late they've stopped it. They didn't stop it when it was happening, even though a federal judge had ordered them to bring those people back before landing in El Salvador, and they just ignored that order, which is very ominous, because it gets us into that area of dictator land again. That if the executive branch, the president and his minions, are not going to obey federal court orders, we're living in dictator land at that point. Because clearly the Congress is not going to do anything. They're Republican dominated. They've got to support Trump, whatever he does. This is part of being in the Trumpista cult, that you've got to just keep nodding your head and approving whatever he's doing. So, and let's face it, much of the Congress is owned by the national security establishment, the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon. I mean, like if any congressman even dares to say anything about the military, the CIA, they threaten to close military installations or bases in their district. And the mainstream press says, oh, we have an ineffective congressman, we need to replace him, and so forth. So most congressmen never buck the national security establishment. So here we have this major assault on a major aspect of our freedom, civil liberties. You see it now with due process of law, where they're shipping people out without any kind of hearing. They now are calling for a suspension of habeas corpus, the linchpin of a free society. They have military tribunals instead of trial by jury. I mean, it's so ironic that military people, and I think CIA people too, take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, which is a sham anyway, because they're going to just do whatever the president orders them to do, just like in every other country where there's a national security establishment. But they go to Guantanamo, Cuba, in a foreign country, to establish a torture center. Oh, by the way, the Bill of Rights also prohibits the imposition of cruel and unusual punishments. Well, that's proven to be a joke with the national security establishment, because they've been torturing people for umpteen years. Not to mention state-sponsored assassinations. The Fifth Amendment is very clear. You're not going to kill anybody without due process of law, which means a hearing and a trial. They assassinate people, including Americans. But what's fascinating is they put it in Cuba in order to be free of these constitutional restraints, the restraints of the Bill of Rights. Even though they've taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, they wanted a place where they didn't have to comply with the Constitution. All right, so that's what's going on in the area of civil liberties under the Trump administration. Federal spending, another interesting topic. We saw the Doge, shutting down this or shutting down that, whatever. And I kept saying, it doesn't really matter whether you shut this thing down or shut that thing down and you fire these bureaucrats or whatever, if your overall spending increases. And that's what's been going on. That they haven't cut federal spending overall at all under this administration. It's what I've always said. Republicans are big spenders. They're just big spenders in different ways than big spending Democrats. You've got all this immigration enforcement. I mean, that costs money, flying people back to foreign countries. I forget how much it costs, but it's like 100 times more than commercial airlines, something like that. And then you've got all the costs of the detention centers. And when they pick up these immigrant students that they're upset at because they're not supporting the Israeli government and what the Israeli government is doing to Palestinians in Gaza. So they're picking them up and saying, well, see, it's not just the illegal immigrants because they're here illegally. They're saying you don't have a right to come into our country and not support Israel. So we're going to deport you, even though you're legal. And so they ship them all down to Louisiana because Louisiana, these are students in the Northeast. They ship them down to Louisiana because the judges there are more right wing. So they're forum shopping. They're looking for the judge that will sustain their deportation and their destruction of freedom of speech. And those flights cost money. Okay, so they're spending more money than they're bringing in. Okay, same thing Biden was doing. Same thing they've always done. And then adding to the debt. I mean, you got $37 trillion in debt. You can see the reflection now in the bond market. Long-term bonds are getting real shaky again. And then they just announced that they want 20,000 new inspectors or enforcers of the deportation efforts. Now, I think there are around 6,000 that are in charge of deportations. They want now 20,000 new ones. What's that going to cost? I mean, you got salaries and training and then, a car. And I mean, it all adds up. Oh, but that's not all. That Trump has announced that he wants to give the Pentagon $1 trillion. I mean, that's up from, I don't know, 700 or 800 billion, something like that. Well, I thought that he was going to come in and do something about the deep state, like really downsize the deep state. What we really ought to do is get rid of the deep state entirely and replace it with a limited government republic, which is what we our founding governmental system. This deep state thing has been absolutely atrocious, and he used to talk like that. He used to talk about, well, sometimes intimate that he would get rid of the CIA. I'm not sure he ever really said it directly, but I knew it was nonsense. He's not going to try to get rid of the CIA. He's going to bend the knee to the CIA. The CIA is too powerful. Every president knows it. And then even if you did, what difference would it make? You're talking about one great big military intelligence apparatus that's divided into three wings: the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA. You get rid of one, all of its functions are simply absorbed into the Pentagon or the NSA. Get rid of the NSA, well, then it's one great big Pentagon. See, it doesn't have to be divided into three parts. It can be just one great big military intelligence complex. That's the way some national security states are. I think Egypt's national security state is like that. It's just one great big military complex, and underneath that military complex, intelligence, assassination, torture, and so forth. Owning hotels, and because the military controls everything there in Egypt. So here Trump is adding $1 trillion budget to the Pentagon. Now, I'm sure part of this is to ingratiate himself with the Pentagon, the military, get the military on his side, putting in his generals, so that if the matter ever came up where he needed the military, let's say habeas corpus is suspended like they want to do, he can use the military, just like Pinochet did, to start rounding people up. Doesn't have to worry about the courts anymore. Round up anybody he wants. And they can torture him because torture is legal now. Well, it's not legal, but nobody's going to be brought to trial for it. Trump's immune totally. The Supreme Court's already said that. But his minions are immune too. Nobody in the military or the CIA is going to be indicted for torture. We saw that in the torture scandal where they remember they had videotaped the torture sessions. And then they destroyed them. They destroyed all the videotapes when they found out that people wanted to see them. And they destroyed them just like they did with MK Ultra. All the files on MK Ultra where they were putting Americans under drugs and doing what else? I mean, we don't know what else they were doing to them, besides just subjecting them to drugs. Because all the records were, at least 99.99% of the records were destroyed on purpose, so that Americans couldn't find out the full extent of what they were doing with MK Ultra. So you put all this thing together, it's the exact opposite of moving in the direction of freedom. Okay, now we libertarians, that's what we're about. We want a free society, and most of us came into this thing with on economic liberty grounds. Ludwig von Mises, Austrian economics, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Murray Rothbard, and so forth. That's the way I came into this thing. But, the other part of this thing, which is what the right wing doesn't understand, is that even if you have economic liberty, if you don't have civil liberties, you're not living in a free society. In fact, it's very possible you're living under a very tyrannical regime. Don't forget that under the Pinochet regime, which Republicans still extol to this day, conservatives love Pinochet. They think he's fantastic. That he brought in the Chicago boys, you see, the people who had been educated at the University of Chicago under Friedman and the free market advocates there at the University of Chicago. So that's their trump card on Pinochet. Oh, no, he was good, Jacob, for economic liberty. But what they're ignoring is the civil liberties aspect, that when a regime has omnipotent power to round people up, no habeas corpus, no trial by jury, torture them, kill them, do whatever you want to them, gruesome things. I wouldn't even begin to tell you some of the gruesome thing they did to the women. They rounded up some 40,000 people, all of whom were innocent, okay? Innocent in the sense that their only crime was believing in socialism. A lot of these people were like 18, 19-year-old teenagers, college students that just, you know how college students are. They're idealistic, they're young, they're excited, they get involved, they see this socialist ideal. There's that old saying that if at 20 you're not a socialist, you have no heart. If at 30 you're still a socialist, you have no head. Okay, but they were being punished, these young people, for getting excited about Allende's socialism, just like Americans got excited over Roosevelt's socialism with Social Security and then Johnson's socialism with Medicare and Medicaid. These were all things Allende believed in. So, okay, there is one interesting aspect, though, that Trump announced that he was going to reverse his anti-refugee policy this past week, which was kind of interesting, to make an exception to it, that he was going to let in some refugees from Africa. Wow, well, this is quite surprising. There's a lot of people suffering in Africa from tyranny, oppression, starvation, and I thought, wow, well, this is an interesting thing. I wonder what caused Trump to change his policy. And so those refugees are going to be coming in, or maybe they already have come in, I'm not sure. But I think it was around 60 refugees. So it's not real clear why he changed his policy on these particular refugees. It's probably worth mentioning that they're from South Africa and they're white refugees from Africa. Okay, the tariffs, the tariff suspension is still going on, but U.S. officials are now negotiating with Chinese officials. Kind of interesting. Not clear what's going on there, but they did reach a deal with England on a tariff deal. I don't know the exact terms, but it was lower tariffs than were ordinarily the case that Trump had announced, which takes us back to this whole notion is that Trump was saying that tariffs are good in and of themselves, and now he's saying, oh, but see, we're negotiating lower tariffs. Well, I don't get that. If they're good in and of themselves, then why are you crowing about getting them lowered? Because in the negotiations, you got to lower your tariffs too. You see? And so he's saying, well, this is a good thing that both sides, we've reached a deal where both sides have lowered their tariffs. Well, okay, so tariffs are not the good thing, because if tariffs were a good thing, how about negotiating everybody raises their tariffs? Well, we can see the catastrophe that's been, especially with China. I mean, just catastrophe for both sides. I mean, it's amazing the destructive nature of government when it does this type of thing. It's phenomenal. It bankrupts small businesses and big businesses on both sides. It's quite incredible. So, they're over there talking. It's going to be interesting to see if they can reach a deal. There's so much animosity and so much anti-Chinese sentiment. I mean, it's so interesting because some years ago, there wasn't this big anti-China sentiment. It was more positive attitudes toward China. But then the national security establishment inculcates this notion. They see China rising, and empires hate competitors. Okay, the U.S. was the sole remaining empire at the end of the Cold War, and China starts liberalizing its economy, loosening up on the rules and regulations, leaving people free to open businesses or freer to open businesses and accumulate wealth. And all of a sudden you have this booming society, which of course means more tax revenues for the Chinese government. And so that's what just sent U.S. officials ballistic, because they see this rising power and they say, oh no, this is a rising competitor or enemy or rival or adversary, all this imperialist terms that the mainstream press buys into, and of course the national security establishment's promoting. And so when they start these trade wars, it's with the idea of diminishing, weakening this power. Now, they know it's going to hurt the United States too. It's going to bankrupt a lot of people here, farmers or whatever. But they figure, well, it'll weaken the big empire by, let's say, 30%, but it throws the whole other nation, the competitor, into total bankruptcy. And so that's the idea behind these trade wars. It's also the idea behind a lot of these sanctions and embargoes and so forth. Just to keep everybody down so that the sole remaining empire remains the sole remaining empire, even if it's not as powerful because of the damage that the trade war is doing to the nation itself. And let me wrap up here by just reminding everybody that we're dealing with a system that's really a bad system, and people don't want to recognize that. It was a bad mistake to convert America to a welfare state. It was a bad mistake to convert America to a warfare state. The drug war has been a disaster. The immigration controls have been a disaster. Everything's just been a disaster. $37 trillion in debt now and climbing. And it's getting worse and worse. And so this experiment of statism has really been a disaster for this country. There's just no question about it. A total disaster. But instead of confronting that, the idea is let's get a scapegoat. And the scapegoats are illegal immigrants. That the idea is, if we can just cleanse our nation of these illegal immigrants, the system will finally work. They're the reason why this statism hasn't worked. If we can just get rid of all them, everything will be fine. Well, it's not going to be fine. They're just scapegoats. That's all they are. And you could get rid of every illegal immigrant, and I guarantee you, the statism is still not going to work. All they're going to do in the process is inflict more suffering, more abuse, more mistreatment on people at the same time as destroying our own freedom. And that's another important thing to remember in this, is that as they do all these things to these scapegoats, they are destroying our freedom, economic liberty, freedom of association, due process of law, trial by jury, habeas corpus. They're using the scapegoats as a way to not only mistreat them, but also destroy our freedom in the process. In order to get this country back on the right track, or to use Trump's verbiage, to make America great again, we got to stop scapegoating people, and we need to confront the root causes of the problems our country faces. And those root problems are the statism that 20th century Americans adopted and 21st century Americans have continued. I'm Jacob Hornberger, and this is Trump Watch. I'll see you all next week.